Produce, I know, can be one of the trickiest things when thinking about storage because there are so many different produce items and so many of them are stored in different ways. But I want to give you some general tips and ideas as far as how do we store these different items. One thing I like to remember when I'm at the store and I get home and I'm wondering, how do I store this item is how did they have it stored when I was at the grocery store? Was it in the refrigerated section, getting misted, making sure it was staying moisturized, or was it in a cool, dry place like the center of the produce aisle? This is a helpful rule of thumb, and I myself still look things up too if I'm unsure. So always use us as a resource, use the internet as a resource if you're ever wondering for a specific produce item, how to make it last absolutely the longest. First, I want to talk about some tips for storing things outside of our fridge because there are a couple things that we do want to store outside of the fridge. Things like tomatoes, bananas, potatoes, sweet potatoes, and garlic and onions all can be stored outside of our fridge. Those garlic and onions, we want to keep them away from the rest of our produce items because the gases they release can make the other things ripen a lot faster. So keep your garlic and onions a little bit separate, and then the rest of those items, keep them in that cool, dry place. The tomatoes, we want to make sure that when they're getting a beautiful red color, we can move those into the fridge if we want to keep them a little bit fresher for longer so that they don't continue to ripen. That is the same for some other produce items as well that start on the counter and end up in the fridge. So those are things like apples, pears, mangoes, and avocados. Those we can first keep on our counter to get them nice and ripe to the perfect way that we want them. And then we can move them into our fridge once they are at their peak ripeness. A good rule of thumb for putting things in the fridge is to keep them in some sort of loose packaging. We don't want it to be too tight, or you can put them in the crisper drawers of your fridge. There are a couple exceptions to the loose packaging rule. We do want to keep our other root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and parsnips in sealed containers. That will help keep it fresher for longer. And then things like dark leafy greens, we want to keep those in a nice dry place in our fridge. So think trying to keep them separate from maybe some other produce items that might release moisture. Now, if you're thinking, I want to cut some of these produce items so that I can eat them sooner and I don't have to worry about it, just think again about how you want to keep those stored. If you cut up some greens, they will spoil a little bit faster, but wrapping them in some paper towels is a really good practice to keep them from going bad quicker because it keeps that moisture away. If you want to cut something like carrots or celery to munch on throughout the week, store it in a little bit of water. That moisture will help so that it continues to receive that moisture and can even bring it back to life if you've maybe forgotten about your celery or your carrots in the fridge, like I know I have sometimes. But again, when we're thinking about produce, majority of it is going to go in the fridge. We have some items that are starting on the counter and going into the fridge, and some that just stay on the counter. But for everything else, keep it in the fridge, keep it in a nice cool place, in a crisper drawer, in a loose container or packaging, and you're going to get the optimum freshness out of that item. Again, if you have any specific questions about a specific produce item and how you store that, be sure to let us know and ask your questions so we can help you get the most out of your produce.